have the time and take a stroll in your mind. In August of '64, a Tonkin Gulf incident ignites a war. Admiral Morrison gets attacked, then America strikes back. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.
Welcome to part 19 of my video summary of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Chapter 21, A Whiter Shade of Pale, Arthur Lee and Love. This series is based on a book, so it's best to start at the beginning. I'll leave a link to Chapter 1 and a pinned comment. And again, a big thank you for watching. Chapter 21, A Whiter Shade of Pale, Arthur Lee and Love.
We definitely started what became the hippie movement, and it spread from there up to Haight-Ashbury and the Fillmore in San Francisco, and then all across the nation.
Arthur Lee, vocalist for the band Love.
Arthur was the whitest black guy I knew. He didn't live the black lifestyle, always liked the white way of life, and liked white girls.
Producer Skip Taylor. Of all the bands to pour out of Laurel Canyon during its heyday, none is more shrouded in mystery and rumor than Love, fronted by one of the most talented and troubled figures on the Sunset Strip, the menacingly charismatic Arthur Lee. Though Lee and his bandmates never achieved the sales figures of contemporaries like The Doors, The Byrds, and the Mamas and the Papas, the band's body of work continues to be hugely influential, and its album Forever Changes is widely considered to be amongst the greatest rock albums of all time. Arthur Porter Taylor was born in Memphis, Tennessee on March 7, 1945. Agnes Porter was the daughter of Ed Porter, a white man, and Malvise Mal Mosley, a very fair-skinned black woman. Throughout her life, most of Agnes's friends and acquaintances assumed she was white. Chester Taylor, a black cornet player, was Arthur's father, but Arthur only saw him a few times throughout his life, and he consequently never knew whether he had any half-siblings on his father's side. Arthur's early years were spent in Memphis, where he was raised by his doting, although authoritarian mother and her sister Vera, who frequently babysat while Agnes worked. Vera was a heavy drinker and smoker who Arthur credited with starting him on cigarettes when he was just 3. According to Arthur, Aunt Vera died from ingesting rat poison, which must have had a considerable impact on the young boy. Growing up just one block away was friend and classmate Johnny Eccles, 2 years younger than Arthur. In 1952, Agnes and then 7-year-old Arthur uprooted and moved to Los Angeles. The next year, Johnny Eccles and his family decided to move to L.A. as well, strangely finding a home just 2 doors down from Arthur's new family home. Agnes soon met Clinton C.L. Lee, whom she married on April 23, 1955. 5 years later, C.L. legally adopted Arthur, who would from then on be known as Arthur Lee. Clinton had served in the military during World War II before settling in Los Angeles in 1946. Arthur's authorized biography provides the following description of C.L. Lee's post-war employment.
Skilled at masonry, he prospered during LA's post-war construction boom. Arthur would often point to the sculptures that adorned buildings along Wilshire Boulevard as evidence of his stepfather's handiwork.
Many of those adornments, as with those on the monuments of Washington carved by Carl Franzoni's ancestors, are loaded with Masonic symbolism. Arthur's L.A. neighborhood was filled with musical influences. Little Richard, who had such a profound influence on John Kay, was a neighbor, as was singer Bobby Day. Ray Charles had a recording studio nearby. Attending Dorsey High School with Albert were Billy Preston and future Beach Boy Mike Love. And Arthur, unlike other kids in the neighborhood, but very much like other future Laurel Canyon stars, had musical instruments and a reel-to-reel tape recorder, as well as a television. He was also known for always having money in his pocket. Lee was a naturally gifted athlete who served as the captain of Dorsey High's basketball team. He was also known as a tough kid who didn't shy away from a fight. In the late 1950s, legendary fighter Sugar Ray Robinson lived around the corner, and Arthur entertained thoughts of becoming a boxer. Instead, he opted to pursue a musical career, dropping out of high school during his senior year. Arthur had formed his first successful band while still in school. Dubbed Arthur Lee and the Lags, their first professional gig was at an exclusive Beverly Hills country club, right across the street from future bandmate Brian McLean's family home. The Lags' unscrupulous agent, routinely booked them as the Coasters or the Drifters, or whoever else had a current hit on the charts. Lee and the rest of the group were, though quite young, very accomplished musicians who could mimic the sound of numerous other bands. While still a minor, Lee recorded his first single, The Ninth Wave, for prestigious Capitol Records. The release received little promotion, though, and failed to chart. Also, while still a minor, he received a brand new Corvair Monza, courtesy of Stepdad Clinton. In 1964, he wrote the song My Diary for vocalist Rosa Lee Brooks. The guitar work on the single was supplied by an unknown musician named Jimi Hendrix, who had never before set foot in a recording studio. That same year, Lee disbanded the Lags and formed the American Four with longtime friend and classmate Johnny Eccles. They soon added acclaimed local drummer Don Chonka. The group was essentially a top 40 cover band, once again good enough to sound like anyone they chose to mimic, though they did release an original single, Lucy Baines, named for the first daughter who had spent the night out on a town with Gene Clark. One figure on the Canyon scene who would prove to be hugely influential on young Arthur was club owner and former cop gangster Elmer Valentine. Arthur would later write that,
Elmer Valentine was not only a good friend, he was like a father figure to me.
Another major influence was the emergence of the Byrds and the human circus surrounding them. As Eccles would later recall,
What impressed us when we saw the Byrds were the people in the audience, what the Los Angeles Times called the Sherwood Forest people, because they looked like something out of Robin Hood. It was this huge, fascinating group of eclectic people, all dressed totally bizarrely, with long, long hair. These were the leftovers from the Beat era. They followed the Byrds around.
Those Sherwood Forest people were, of course, the Vito Polakis crew. And they would soon be following Arthur and his band around as well. When the band had worked its way up from playing a bowling alley to playing a Brave New World club, they changed their name to the Grassroots. They also added a rhythm guitarist by the name of Robert Kenneth Beaujolais. Shortly thereafter, they added a second rhythm guitarist, Brian McLean, who had grown up amid considerable wealth. His father was an architect for the rich and the famous. As Brian later acknowledged, he knew everyone in Hollywood. Brian had been a regular at the New Baudelaire Club, along with Gene Clark, Roger McGowan, David Crosby, Michael Clark, and John Kay. He had dropped out of high school at 17 to pursue an art career, but had decided to focus on music instead, unsuccessfully auditioning to be one of the Monkees. Soon after, he met Arthur and Johnny and gave up his temporary employment as the Byrds' road manager. For a brief time, both Bobby and Brian filled the rhythm guitarist position, making it a six-piece band. However, Arthur soon found that the band wasn't earning enough to carry both of them, so Beaujolais was let go. Brian was chosen over Bobby in part because McLean had a connection to the Vito crew, guaranteeing the fledgling band a lively audience and a lot of buzz on the strip. Beaujolais would later migrate to the San Francisco area for the famed Summer of Love, moving into the former Russian embassy with filmmaker and occultist Kenneth Anger, who, according to Bobby, quoted in John Gilmore's Garbage People,
had this contact with this group called The Process.
Anger was also, not too surprisingly, yet another son of the military intelligence complex. His father, Wilbur Anglemeyer, had been an engineer who developed machine guns for Kellogg during World War II and later went to work for Douglas Aircraft. Beaujolais played in a number of long-forgotten bands, many bearing names with obvious occult overtones. While playing with a lineup known as Orchestra, Bobby once shared a stage with Stephen Stills, Neil Young, and the rest of Buffalo Springfield. Another formation he briefly joined was known as the Magic Powerhouse of Oz. Beaujolais returned to L.A. in October of 1967 following a split with Anger. Meanwhile, Charles Manson, released from prison on March 21, 1967, established his first roots in Los Angeles around December of 1967, at a notorious home in Topanga Canyon known as the Spiral Staircase, which by some reports was a cult gathering spot. It was there that Bobby first met Charlie, and the two aspiring musicians quickly formed a bond, with Bobby agreeing to join Charlie's band, The Milky Way. That supergroup broke up after only one gig. However, though, Bobby and Charlie remained close. Beausoleil, who, according to John Gilmore's Garbage People, was chronically abused as a child by an aunt and an uncle, with a former girlfriend describing it as
typical of the worst of the beep and other abuse brought down on a little kid.
had a brief film career as well, appearing as Lucifer in Anger's Invocation of My Demon Brother, though the footage was originally shot for Lucifer Rising, and as Cupid in Robert Carl Cohen's Mondo Hollywood. Later, as previously noted, Beausoleil would compose, perform, and record the soundtrack for Lucifer Rising from a prison cell, with the help of fellow Mansonite musician Steve Clem Grogan. At the time he met Manson, Beausoleil was living with musician Gary Hinman, as was Mansonite Mary Berner. Hinman's Topanga Canyon home reportedly featured a basement drug lab. By 1968, Bobby had his own place in Topanga Canyon at 19844 Horseshoe Lane. By early 1969, he was living in an apartment in Laurel Canyon. In July of that year, Bobby, Berner, and Susan Atkins murdered Hinman in his home, reportedly on the orders of Manson. Bobby was arrested on August 6, just 2 days before the carnage at CeeLo Drive. But here, I suppose, I may have digressed just a bit. Love's initial lineup of Arthur Lee on vocals, Johnny Eccles on lead guitar, Brian McLean on vocals and rhythm guitar, John Finkelstein on bass, and Don Chunka on drums would not last long. Actually, as was true with Steppenwolf, none of the configurations of Arthur's band would last long. In those early days, Lee and Eccles were still living at home with their parents. Brian, though, had moved into the upper loft of the Vito Clay studio. On the lower level was the Byrds' rehearsal space. By the end of summer 1965, Arthur and Johnny had moved in as well. As John Finkelstein recalled,
Vito and those guys were like our groupies. They trailed us everywhere we played and brought their whole scene with them.
But unlike the other group with whom Arthur's band shared both groupies and rehearsal space, the Grassroots were considered to be a great live band, arguably the best band that Laurel Canyon had to offer. The band, though, had a slight problem. The name Grassroots was already taken by another band. So, in the fall of 1965, Arthur's band became Love, claimed by some to be an homage to the departed guitarist Bobby Beausoleil, whose nickname was Cupid. With the name change came a new venue, Bido Litos, yet another of the small clubs lining the Sunset Strip during its glory days. Vito and company, of course, came along for the ride. Kenny Forsay, who had arrived in L.A. in 1964, was recruited as the band's new bass player, replacing Fleckenstein. Forsay's roommate, Swiss-born Albin Snoopy Festerer, was subsequently hired to fill in on drums for the frequently absent Chonka. Don was, by all accounts, a much more proficient drummer than Snoopy, but his prodigious drug intake made him extremely unreliable. In January of 1966, the band was signed by Jacques Holzman to his Elektra Records label. Holzman was, to say the least, an unlikely success story. Between the years 1950 and 1955, over 1,000 record labels were reportedly launched in the U.S. Only 2 survived, one of which was Atlantic Records. The other was Jacques Holzman's Elektra Records, launched, as industry legend has written, while Holzman, the son of a Harvard-educated doctor, was a 19-year-old student living in the dorms at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. The venture was purportedly financed with just $600, half from Holzman's bar mitzvah and the other half from a classmate's veteran's bonus. As part of Arthur's deal with Holzman, he was given his own publishing company, Grassroots Records. Publishing royalties were paid through Third Story Music, a company controlled by the shadowy Herb Cohen and his brother. Arthur also had signed a personal management contract with Cohen. Once signed, the band quickly got to work recording their self-titled debut album. Snoopy laid down all the drum tracks for the perpetually AWOL Chonka. And in a strange turn of events, Eccles, Forsey, and McLean actually played their own instruments in the studio, though Lee did fill in at times. It is said that Lee could play any band member's instrument better than they could, with the notable exception of guitar virtuoso Johnny Eccles. And all of the band members, needless to say, could play better than the guys in the band they shared rehearsal space with. Elektra staff producer Paul Rothchild, who would play a key role in shaping the sound of the second rock band signed by Elektra, The Doors, was doing prison time on a minor drug charge, so Holzman and various others filled in as producers on the disc. Released just a few months after the band was signed, the album featured cover art photographed at, where else, the ruins of a fire-ravaged home in Laurel Canyon. On June 18, 1966, the band made its first television appearance on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. Also appearing was the Bobby Fuller Four, performing their hit song, I Fought the Law. Exactly 1 month later, on July 18, 1966, rising star Bobby Fuller would be found dead in his car, the victim of a very obvious homicide that was treated by the LAPD as that thing that people do themselves that starts with an S. At about that same time, Arthur moved into what was known as the Castle, a massive estate that occupied a full city block and was, by some reports, the one-time home of Bela Lugosi. Lee had previously been living on one floor of a large home owned by Elmer Valentine. It is said that the members of The Doors, and Jim Morrison in particular, idolized Love and its leader, Arthur Lee. The Doors' long improvisational songs like The End and When the Music's Over were directly inspired by Love's long improvisational jams, as Ray Manzarek has freely admitted. And Arthur often claimed that Morrison would camp out outside Lee's Laurel Canyon home waiting for a chance to hang out with his label mate. For a time in the mid-1960s, Lee dated Pamela Corson, who would thereafter become Morrison's frequent companion and, upon his death, the sole heir to his sizable estate. Corson was with Morrison when he died under what remains to this day a shroud of mystery. She herself was dead less than 3 years later on April 25, 1974, allegedly of a self-administered heroin overdose. Before recording sessions began for the band's sophomore album, Michael Stewart joined as the group's new drummer, with Snoopy moving over to keyboards. Arthur also added John Barberi, also known as T.J. Cantrelli, on saxophone and flute. Little is known about the mysterious Cantrelli, other than he apparently hailed from Compton, California. The new additions made Love, for a brief time, a 7-piece band, which Arthur felt was necessary for the intricate arrangements that were to be featured on the album. Stewart's father worked in the aerospace industry, first in Texas, then in the military town of San Diego, where various other Laurel Canyon notables spent time during their formative years. Stewart scored a scholarship to Pepperdine, then followed by a stint at UCLA. Before joining Love, he played with the Sons of Adam, yet another band that had a communal home in everyone's favorite canyon. The Sons had gotten their start in Baltimore, just outside Washington, D.C., where they were known as Fender 4. Their new name had been bestowed upon them by Vito associate Kim Fowley. Da Capo, Love's second album, was produced by Paul Rothchild, who had, as previously noted, been a fixture at Club 47 in Cambridge in the Boston Strangler days. Rothschild's parole officer, ever accommodating, had signed off on him venturing out to California. The cover art for the new disc was once again photographed at a fire-ravaged home in Laurel Canyon, though the sound of the record was much different than the first, fusing jazz with psychedelic rock. Around the time of the Da Capo sessions, Arthur vacated the castle and moved into what was dubbed the Trip House on Kirkwood Drive in Laurel Canyon, so named in honor of the fact that the film of that name was shot there. About that very same time, Peter Fonda, the star of The Trip, decided to more fully immerse himself in the folk rock scene by recording an entire solo album that, perhaps mercifully, was never to be released. The disc contained a single penned by up-and-comer Graham Parsons. As was true of virtually all of Laurel Canyon stars, members of Love were of military draft age. As John Anarson's biography of Arthur Lee notes,
Unless you were able to secure a college deferment or a coveted 4F ineligibility rejection, the draft compulsory military service was a cold, looming reality for every adolescent male, and Black Americans found themselves drafted in disproportionate quantity.
And yet, shockingly enough, every member of every incarnation of the band, black and white alike, deftly avoided military service. Arthur is said to have fooled the draft board by pretending to be gay. Snoopy supposedly did so by showing up sleep-deprived and unwashed, and so on. Soon after the recording of Da Capo, Arthur dropped Snoopy and TJ from the roster, and Love once again became a quintet. The pared-down band quickly got to work on the material for what is widely regarded as their masterpiece and essentially their swan song, Forever Changes. Recording sessions began at the dawn of the Summer of Love. The band Love, meanwhile, made the dubious decision to pass on the Monterey Pop Festival. Arthur initially brought in Hal Blaine and the rest of the Wrecking Crew for the Forever Changes sessions, which he later described as a ploy to motivate the band. By that time, Eccles, Forsey, McLean, and Stewart all had serious heroin habits. Arthur, he was shooting up as well, but his drug of choice was cocaine. He was also a prolific smoker of hash and an acid head. In any event, the ploy reportedly worked, and the band pulled it together enough to complete the sessions. But it was the last time they would record together. Though now considered to be one of the finest collections of song ever pressed on vinyl, Forever Changes received a lukewarm reception when released in November of 1967, topping out at number 154 on the charts. Though a local favorite, Love had never established a strong national presence. And by 1968, local gigs were drying up and band members weren't above pawning their instruments for drug money. Arthur decided to let Brian go. Around that same time, road manager Neil Rappaport returned home from a Miami gig and promptly turned up dead. Dark rumors circulated suggesting that band members had murdered Rappaport in a dispute over drugs and money. Years later, Arthur claimed that he
Still didn't know what happened to him.
Some of the rumors circulating suggested that he had been hanged. Snoopy told an interviewer that
Neil and Johnny Eccles became shooting partners, and then one day Johnny fixed Neil a little too much. Can you dig it? Technically, you could call it murder, but each guy prepares his own needle.
by mid-1968, Love had ceased to exist as a band. There hadn't been any formal breakup. Arthur simply had stopped calling the others, who were rapidly descending into a downward spiral of heroin addiction. Forsey was living in the converted garage of a home in Laurel Canyon, with his accommodations, according to Arthur, painted entirely black, including the windows. By late summer 1968, Lee had assembled a new band he was calling Love, though it didn't contain any of the 8 musicians who had previously played under that name. John Fleckenstein, Don Chanka, Johnny Eccles, Kenny Forsey, Brian McLean, Snoopy Fifthesser, T.J. Cantrelli, and Michael Stewart. Arthur served as singer, songwriter, manager, booking agent, arranger, and producer. Circa 1969, Lee sold the Trip House and moved to a more secluded, secure location off Coldwater Canyon. There he had become somewhat of a recluse, though stepdad C.L., who handled maintenance of the property, was a frequent presence. That same year, Arthur declined an invitation to play at Woodstock, just as he had done with Monterey. He did, though, release 2 new Love albums in rapid succession, just 3 months apart at the tail end of 1969. Neither gained any traction on the sales charts. A year later, in December of 1970, he tried again with an album entitled False Start. The disc generated a certain amount of buzz owing to the fact that the first track on the album featured the lead guitar work of Jimi Hendrix, who had also helped arrange the song. It was the first release of new music by the guitar legend since his tragic death, just 3 months earlier, on September 18, 1970. The album nevertheless failed to sell. Shortly before his death, Hendrix had talked to Lee about putting a new band together, which was to feature the 2 of them and Steve Winwood. Arthur had another curious connection to Hendrix. Both had been lovers of Devon Wilson, who had been one of the last people to see Hendrix alive, and who died in a mysterious fall at the Chelsea Hotel just 5 months after the death of Hendrix. And so it was that Arthur Lee was romantically linked to 2 women, Corson and Wilson, who in turn were romantically linked to 2 legendary rock stars, Morrison and Hendrix, with all 4 of them subsequently turning up dead in a span of just 3.5 years, from September 1970 through April of 1974. Lee released his first solo album, Vindicator, in late 1972. It was poorly reviewed and failed to generate much in any way of sales, so Arthur put together a new version of Love and came back with Reel to Reel in 1975. No one seemed to really care. Rumors soon began circulating that Arthur was reduced to working as a house painter, or, worse yet, was panhandling on Sunset Boulevard. If true, it was a remarkable fall from grace for a guy accustomed to such luxuries as getting his clothes custom made. He would remain a rather elusive enigma for the next several years, and then began a series of incarcerations. Meanwhile, in 1980, his uncle, Johnson Porter, was gunned down on the mean streets of Los Angeles. In December 1983, Lee was arrested and charged with arson, a crime that he did time for at the California Institute for Men in Chino, California. Upon his release, he left L.A. for Memphis, returning to L.A. in 1988, only to soon be arrested and charged with auto theft, a crime for which he briefly served more time. Upon his release this time, he moved into his girlfriend's apartment in Valley Village, just north of Coldwater Canyon. A year and a half later, in March of 1991, he sold 50% of his song publishing catalog to raise cash. 1 year later, Arthur released what was to be his last album of new music, Arthur Lee in Love. Once again, it was not well received by fans or critics. After remaining largely out of sight for the next 3 years, Lee was arrested on June 10, 1995 for discharging a firearm off his balcony. He was also found to be in possession of a cache of armor-piercing Teflon bullets and, of course, drugs. Like many of his contemporaries in the peace and love crowd, Arthur had a long-time fondness for guns. Less than 3 weeks later, he was arrested once again for a domestic violence incident. On June 27, 1996, Lee was convicted on the weapon and drug charges, a third strike under California law that resulted in a 12.5-year prison sentence. At the end of 2001, he was granted an appeal and released to face a new trial. At retrial, he was convicted of lesser charges and sentenced to time served. Arthur was a free man once again, but that freedom proved to be rather short-lived. On August 3, 2006, Lee passed away in Memphis after a battle with leukemia. Arthur was not the only member of the band to spend time in a California correctional facility. Don Conca, the band's original drummer, though he never actually played on any Love records, reportedly served 10 years or more on drug-related charges. In later years, he rejoined Arthur and reformulated versions of Love, though nothing that came from those sessions and performances was recorded. Conca died on September 24, 2004. Many who knew him were surprised that he hadn't died years earlier. Brian McLean initially walked away from the music business following his discharge from the band, as one might expect from a kid born into a life of privilege. He dabbled for a time in the world of high finance, trading stocks and real estate before suffering a nervous breakdown, and then finding his salvation in the mid-1970s with an evangelical Christian ministry. He then returned to the music industry, focusing largely on Christian music and collaborating in times with his half-sister, Maria McKee, vocalist for the short-lived band Lone Justice. On Christmas Day, 1998, McLean was dining with writer Kevin Delaney at a Los Angeles eatery when Brian excused himself to use the restroom, where he promptly collapsed and died of a reported heart attack at the relatively young age of 52. Delaney had been working on a book about the legendary band, but that book never materialized. The fate of T.J. Cantarelli is one of the many lingering mysteries that surrounds the band. It is generally assumed that he died sometime in the early 1990s, but no one really knows for sure. Alban Snoopy Pfister and Michael Stewart, now known as Michael Stewart Ware, both reportedly disappeared for varying lengths of time, but both eventually resurfaced, with Stewart Ware publishing a biography of the band in 2003 and Snoopy releasing an obscure solo album in 2008. Another enduring mystery surrounds the post-Love activities of Johnny Echols and Ken Forsey, both of whom dropped out of sight for an extended period of time. According to persistent rumors, the pair were reduced to holding up donut shops to get drug money, resulting in lengthy prison sentences following convictions on multiple counts of armed robbery. Echols has claimed that the rumors are untrue, but he has acknowledged that the pair were arrested outside a LA donut shop, and the fact remains that the two disappeared for nearly 20 years. Forsey, who had showed quite an aptitude for aerospace engineering before embarking on a music career, died of a brain tumor on January 5, 1998, in the same year as McLean's curious death. It is said he had been obsessed with the notion of global political conspiracies in his final years. His alleged partner in crime, Johnny Echols, is currently living in the New Age mecca of Sedona, Arizona. Ken Forsey was not, it should perhaps be noted, the only Laurel Canyon local with prior connections to the aerospace industry. At least 2 of Charlie's girls had such connections as well. Nancy Pittman, who was introduced to the Manson family by actress Angela Lansbury, was the daughter of an aerospace engineer who designed missile guidance systems. And Squeaky Fromm, childhood friend of actor-comedian Phil Hartman, was the daughter of yet another aerospace worker, one who had been described as being abusively authoritarian. Arthur Lee also had, by numerous accounts, an authoritarian streak of his own. According to drummer Snoopy, Lee was
A megalomaniac, extremely authoritarian.
Record producer David Anderell noted that he didn't
Want to say that Arthur was demonic, but he was very manipulative and destructive.
Lee also had undeniable charisma and a commanding and somewhat menacing stage presence. Michael Ware has written that
Arthur had an aura of calm, quiet power. He seemed better than regular human beings, more capable. Everyone looked up to him and respected him and feared him.
like others in this saga, Arthur Lee also appears to have suffered with a rather pronounced dissociative disorder. Drummer Gary Stern once said that he believed
There were 2 Arthurs, as if he was schizophrenic.
the rock and roll photographer Herbie Worthington described Arthur as
A walking contradiction. He could be the sweetest person one minute, and then his mind would click, and he could be an asshole.
Worthington's take on Lee, needless to say, sounds hauntingly like Bonnie Clark's take on Brother Gene.
He could be very warm and loving, but that could change in a heartbeat.
And with that, we complete Chapter 21, A Whiter Shade of Pale, Arthur Lee and Love. Thanks for watching my video summary of
Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon.
Until I made this series, I never really heard of Arthur Lee or the band Love. But this episode really shows that the most talented people aren't necessarily the ones that were the most famous out of Laurel Canyon. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like, subscribe, comment, all that other junk. And I'll catch you on the next episode.
Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.